understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? Welcome to the podcast. We're going to get straight into it. This podcast is going to be all about Germany. Why? Because this week is the 10th anniversary of the week that Angela Merkel, in the summer of 2015, late August, said, Wir Schaffen das, which is we can do this, and opened Germany's doors to many, many refugees. What we're going to look at this week is what happened. What happened in Germany, society, culture, politics, economics over that subsequent 10-year period. And we're going to be guided by the brilliant German historian, Katja Hoyer. So let's go straight to Germany and talk to Katja. Katja, how are you doing? It's good to see you.
Yeah, no, good to see you too.
Katja actually just said to me, I said, how are you, Katja? She says, I'm as tired as you look. So that really gives you an indication of the state of me this morning. Now, listen, I know that you are in a celebratory mood because you have just handed in the manuscript of your new book. Tell me what it is, when it's coming out, and what the story is.
It's called Weimar, Life on the Edge of Catastrophe, and is hopefully just as dramatic as that sounds. It'll come out in May next year, 2026, and it's about the town of Weimar between the two world wars. I think when I talk to people about this, they all say, oh, I didn't even know there was a town called Weimar. I thought it was just the Republic. And that's exactly the point. So the German relaunch, if you want to call it that, after the First World War, the attempt to create a more civilized, more democratic country started in Weimar, and they called it the whole thing, rebranded it basically after the name of Weimar, because it is so central, that town, to German culture. It's where most of the national poets lived and worked. You know, sort of lots of composers. Liszt, for instance, lived there for a while. So did Nietzsche. Like all the great German sort of thinkers and doers spent some time in Weimar over the centuries. And the idea was to use this name to create a more civilized, more or less military Germany than could have been done in Berlin. But it's also because it's the heart of German culture, a town that the Nazis obsess over, and where they also relaunched their campaign when Hitler comes out of prison in 1924. And so it's a really interesting point. I follow several people who live in Weimar and sort of are observers, but also contributors to these events, all the way from socialist resistance fighters to outright Nazis. And I follow these people, and Nietzsche's sister, who makes sure that
Nietzsche's sister?
Yeah, and who still lives there and is trying to make sure that the legacy of her brother lives on, and the Nazis sort of make her an offer that she can't refuse. And the whole Nietzsche's whole idea of superhumans, of the Herrenmenschen, basically becomes a Nazi idea as well. So it's an interesting mixture of people, and I follow them between the two world wars to sort of look through this one town to try and see what happened to Germany in that time.
Katja, can I just ask you, where exactly is Weimar?
So Weimar is quite a small town, and it's almost exactly in the center of Germany. Even if you look at it before and after the First World War, when the German territory was still slightly different, even then it sort of worked out, which is why this metaphor of the heart of Germany is almost a geographical one as well. It's slightly off-center, kind of halfway between Munich and Hamburg.
Okay.
Well, the good thing about this is your Irish fans will have a chance to listen to more of this in the flesh, because you were coming to Kilkenomics in early November, and we were going to be discussing this and loads of other things, which is great. Well, listen, congratulations. I know how much of a pain writing a book is, and sitting down and just getting it done and getting it to the copy editor. It's just such a relief, even though now you have to be as humble. You have to put your ego in a drawer when they come back and say, nah, big red line, don't agree, fact check. However, I want to talk to you about an article you wrote this week in the British magazine Unheard. And it's an article that I hadn't thought about, that this week, the final week of August, is the 10th anniversary of the moment when Angela Merkel opened Germany's doors to immigration in 2015. Tell me what happened and how that has changed Germany.
Yes, so as you say, it's the 10-year anniversary now. It's a bit sort of, controversial which date exactly you want to pick, since the whole summer of 2015, is sort of this moment of the refugee crisis where hundreds of thousands of people arrive in Europe, mostly fueled by the civil war that was going on in Syria, but also that triggered sort of refugee movements from other places as well, Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. So basically, you have hundreds of thousands of people arriving in Europe, obviously on the borders mostly, and that puts enormous pressures on countries like Hungary and Italy and Greece. And they are supposed to, according to the so-called Dublin rules that sort of govern the way that this is supposed to work, they were supposed to take in these refugees, register them, and then they were supposed to get redistributed across Europe. And as you can imagine, hundreds of thousands of people arriving all at the same time, this process became very, very difficult. And people just didn't stick to it. In particular, Hungary basically just ended up waving people through. They knew perfectly well people didn't want to stay in Hungary. A lot of them went on to wealthier countries, particularly Germany and Austria. And they basically just bussed people to the borders and allowed them to walk through. And at that point, Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, was faced with a situation where lots of people were arriving at the German borders, and she had to make a decision to let them in, even though they were supposed to, according to the rules, get registered elsewhere. And she decided exactly 10 years ago to suspend that Dublin protocol and just let people in completely unchecked. And that was a controversial decision at the time already, because for one thing, they had no idea if it was actually Syrians arriving or people from elsewhere who'd heard that the borders were open now. And secondly, there were no security checks. So they had no idea if they were letting families from war-torn Syria in, or terrorists, for example, who may have jumped on the bandwagon. So that was already a very sensitive and heated decision at the time. And 10 years on, that debate hasn't got any quieter.
So, because I remember that summer in particular, people, it was mainly coming to Greece, then up via Serbia, Croatia. Then the Hungarians either bust people through, and then the Hungarians built a massive big wall around Hungary, built a big fence. And I think what Mrs. Merkel said is, Wir Schaffen das. We've got this. We can do this. That was the sort of slogan. Now, what did she do? Give me a sense of the numbers, because I wanted to see what has happened since, what has happened to German political culture, German society, German urban culture, etc. But give me a sense of the numbers relative to the German population, the types of people. Were they kids? Were they men? Were they women? All that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we use the word unprecedented a lot in politics these days, but in this case, it actually applies. I mean, the numbers were massive, which is part of the controversy at the time as well. So in 2015 alone, we're officially talking about 1.1 million people who entered the country as asylum seekers. And that's just the people who actually registered once they came in. So the actual figures are likely to be higher of people who just came in and didn't register. So that's 1.1 million people. Just under half of that, about 40% of them, were Syrians. And so the large majority actually weren't Syrians, but people from, for example, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkan countries, and other places as well. Because the news, of course, spread very quickly that Germany was taking in refugees. And there's also the hurdles to get into the welfare system were also pretty low, because the idea was to help people quickly. And so it was quite easy to apply for benefits, for example, as well. So that was quite attractive, of course, if you come from a war-torn country like Afghanistan. 70% of them were male, which was also a controversial point at the time, given the implications on crime and other things, and also housing, in terms of how, do you house people by gender? How do you keep the refugees themselves safe in the camps and in the places where they were being put up? And then Germany tried to distribute them basically in the country to try and make sure it didn't overwhelm its resources. So they were basically within Germany. Then there was a key that they applied that meant that people were then sort of geographically distributed. So this was also suddenly affecting areas that had never before seen any significant immigration, because it was drawn to the cities largely. If people came in, they'd stay in like Berlin or in the Ruhr region in the far west, and people in villages and small towns never really saw many immigrants. Where I grew up in eastern Germany, we had one child in my school, in the entire school, who wasn't sort of, East German, ethnically and culturally. And he was the son of Vietnamese guest workers who had sort of come in the 80s, and sort of didn't...
For your socialist brethren, brethren over in Vietnam.
And other than the fact that he obviously looked Vietnamese, he spoke German without an accent and was completely sort of adapted to the local culture. So people just weren't used to it. And then suddenly the same town would now have, sort of an immigrant population of something like 20% or so because of this recent influx.
20%?
So,
wow.
Well, because they put people locally in sort of either, town halls or gyms or any other facilities that they had, hotels. Therefore, the populations of people who just come in were often very concentrated in the places where they just happened to have found a place to put them. Or they put up for refugees, or they put up container villages, basically, like temporary housing, which often meant that a village would suddenly have, twice the population, because if you have like 250 people in that village beforehand, and then suddenly you put a bunch of containers on the village green, so this caused a lot of upheaval as well. And then Angela Merkel was basically trying to tell people with this Wir Schaffen das slogan, we can do this, that this is a temporary thing and people mustn't worry about this, the country can do that. And because it hasn't stayed a temporary thing, basically the borders have largely, obviously controls came back and things, but largely the situation didn't change. If you said asylum, when you enter Germany, you would be allowed in. So now you have a population of roughly 3.3 or 3.4 million asylum seekers in Germany still, which is about 4% of the population, which is huge compared to many other countries. So this has stayed basically a big topic for people to discuss and for politics to be changed and determined by it.
So in the beginning, I think it's fair to say there was a certain amount of pride. Germans saying this is the right thing to do. We are going to stand up. We're going to be humane. Mrs. Merkel was definitely selling that the new Germany, almost to come back to, this is the new Weimar-esque Germany is going to be open. It's going to be generous. We have the money. We have the power. We're the richest country in Europe. And we have relied on immigrants since the 1970s in huge parts of the economy. So we can do this. What has happened since then? This is what I think is fascinating, because this is arguably the key political and social issue all over Europe. Whether you're Italian, whether you're French, whether you're Irish, whether you're German, this is the key issue. What has happened since then?
Well, I think the main issue was that it blurred the boundaries between regular immigration and asylum seekers from the beginning. So effectively, when Angela Merkel was referring to the sort of benefits that immigration has had to Germany, she was referring to the guest workers that came to West Germany largely in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s to rebuild. They were workers from Turkey and Italy largely. Even then, it was a controversial issue as well, because they were called guest workers, and the whole point was that they'd come and sort of help Germany rebuild and then leave. And that was never going to happen if you live in a sort of wealthier, stable country that pays you reasonably well. You're going to, want to stay. And that was also already controversial then, but the numbers were much smaller. And of course, people came specifically to work with particular skills and people had hired them. And this time you basically have millions of people arriving, not with the intention to sort of settle and live and work somewhere, but because they're fleeing from somewhere else, either the wars that were going on at the time or the economic conditions. And so, a lot of them were and still are reliant on welfare. So now you're in a situation where literally 48% of benefits claimants in Germany are non-Germans, and that creates a huge economic imbalance, and people are increasingly, sort of worried about that and arguing, why are we all working and paying taxes and then basically supporting people who either can't or won't work who've come to Germany. So that's a big issue. And the second thing, I think, was that because they didn't have the time or the resources to security check people, and since then, we've had various horrific terrorist attacks committed by people who'd come as refugees either in 2015, 16 or since. And also, apart from the terrorist attacks, also knife attacks. People were killed, including children, by people with sort of, psychological, psychiatric issues, who again, obviously weren't screened for these things when they came in. And that security element is also something that is huge, apart from, the resources and everything else like housing, the health system, education. Integration more widely is, of course, a huge thing. With numbers that large, people are very difficult to distribute and, to even learn the language, because if you're in your own community, you're not going to. And so now you have schools in some parts of Germany where 80-90% of children are from non-German backgrounds, and they don't talk to German children, so they don't really learn the language, but also the sort of cultural things that, when it comes to relations between men and women, for example, and how women are treated, those kinds of things. They're very controversial to discuss because people tell you very quickly that you've got stereotypes in your mind. But it is an issue if you look at things like public swimming pools, for example, when, even as difficult as it is to discuss, but if men are coming from a country where women are expected to cover up and behave in a certain way, and then you come to Germany and you see like 13, 14-year-old girls in a public, swimming pool with a bikini on, that is obviously a very different cultural situation that people are suddenly expected to behave in a way that we've grown up with, basically in a Western way. Whilst the other way around, you travel to a country with those cultures and the German Foreign Ministry will tell you, just be aware that wearing a bikini in public is not acceptable when you go to certain countries in the Middle East. And the same authorities are not telling you not to worry about the same cultural differences when people from those countries come to Germany. And I think those debates weren't had in an open and honest way because people were too frightened to speak about it. And that's allowed the far right to grow in that, sort of cultural uncertainty and in that atmosphere.
Now, this is kind of fascinating because while people don't want to talk about this in public, the interesting thing about politics is you can vote in private. So people made their feelings felt in the ballot box. And explain to me what happened, where the Alternative for Deutschland comes from, when it starts to kick off. Because I think it's very interesting. You said that in public discussions about culture and discussions about fairness and discussions about we're paying taxes and those our tax money is going off, you're not allowed to say that in a sort of in a liberal democracy where everybody says, well, if you say that, then it's only a hop, skip and jump to the Weimar Republic and only hop, skip and jump to Hitler, right? And that's where you get attacked for. But in private, people express their opinion in the polls.
Yeah, I mean, that's a particular, as you just indicated, the particular issue in Germany, I think, is that Germany has prided itself in the idea of coming back from all these horrors of the 20th century as a new, tolerant and an open country. And so, the moment you try and discuss these things, it opens a lot of very sensitive issues that Germany thought it had overcome. And it rather wouldn't want to talk about it than try and dig these things back out. But as you say, in politics, these things are largely private. You can go into the booth and make your cross wherever you want to on the voting slip. And people found that the existing choice of options didn't cover any skepticism towards this refugee policy. So Angela Merkel was herself the leader of the center-right CDU party, the Christian Democratic Union, which traditionally has been very, very conservative, even by Western standards, I would say, because of this Christian element in it. So in West Germany, society was still, up until reunification, really very traditional and dominated by sort of Christian ideas of how society should work and how families should work and so on. There was even a massive debate around sort of gay marriage and things like that Angela Merkel was involved in. So, people are used to this as a very right-wing, center-right option within the democratic spectrum. And suddenly you've got somebody at the helm who's actually herself quite liberal, I would say has got more social democratic instincts rather than being sort of staunchly conservative, and basically is the architect of this refugee policy and is publicly the head of it and the face of it. So what are you going to do if you are opposed to this open borders policy? You now have a center-right party that is advocating it, and the other parties sit further to the left. So you get an option of clapping Angela Merkel on the shoulder and saying, well done, I agree with you, by voting for her again. or you go further left and you say, actually, this is still far too restrictive and we need to do even more. So, where is the bulk of people supposed to go, democratically speaking, politically speaking, who, according to all surveys, we're talking about sort of between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population very swiftly who have got issues with this, not because they're racist, but because they see all of these issues that I just talked about. And they want a more restrictive course, which is basically what all other countries are doing anyway, apart from Sweden, which has applied a similar kind of liberal policy to what Germany did. They have nowhere to go. And then suddenly the AfD, the alternative for Deutschland, or this name is not a coincidence either. Basically, Merkel always claimed, including on the refugee policy, that her policies are without alternative. Alternativlos was the
Tina,
word.
There is no alternative.
Yeah. So the alternative for Germany said, yes, there is an alternative and we are it. And they positioned themselves to the far right on the political spectrum. Initially, actually, in 2013, when they first became a party, they were a libertarian, quite niche party that was opposed to adopting the euro and other economic issues. And they were basically a splintering off from the Liberal Party, which they felt wasn't liberal enough in economic terms. So it was called the Professors' Party to start with, because it was a bunch of old West German professors who founded it. And then in 2015, just 2 years later, they found this now no longer a niche, this new topic, namely immigration, which nobody else wanted to touch with a barge pole. And they said, we're going to offer an alternative to this. And that was too radical, far too radical for most Germans, which is why you don't get this bulk of sort of 2/3 to 3/4 of people that are averse to the policy actually shifting over to the AfD. It's much smaller than that. But enough people worry about it enough to go there. And basically, because there's this vacuum on the right now, because the Conservatives have shifted so far to the middle, they have room to grow and expand. And for the first time, they enter into parliament literally at the next general election, which is in 2017, with a double digit. So I think it's 17%. And Angela Merkel always said, later when she's asked about this today, do you feel that you're responsible for the rise of the AfD? And she always says, well, they weren't above 20% when I was still in power. But whilst now they are, but nonetheless, the AfD itself, leading figures within the AfD itself have called this refugee policy a gift to their own party. And it was really the best thing that could have happened to them, because there just wasn't, for historical reasons, because Germany is still so sensitive about its own Nazi past, there just wasn't an appetite for a far-right party in the way that had already begun in other countries. That just didn't really exist in Germany, because the CDU always absorbed all of that. Basically, it went quite far to the right and was a broad church to try and incorporate these people.
Well, I mean, I think our British listeners will kind of identify, that the Tories for many, many years were sufficiently right and flexible to take in all classes of right. But that has changed profoundly now, because the Reform Party is in effect the AfD in the UK. And can I just ask you, what is the position now, 10 years later? How big are the AfD? What's the feeling? What's the survey data saying about how Germans actually feel about immigration now?
So it's interesting that the actual attitudes towards immigration haven't changed one bit. It's basically depending on how exactly you ask the question, whether you ask people, do you want less immigration, or whether you say, was the refugee policy wrong? So there are slight variations there, but it's always stayed between 2015 and now, between 2/3 and 3/4 of people who say in each and every survey that they want a stricter migration policy. That's been the case. And that's, something that people like me and others have pointed out for a long time, is that this creates a huge problem for democracy when you've got a large bulk of people wanting one thing and politicians just saying, no, sorry, you can't have that, or we won't even acknowledge that this is a thing. They always say, when they were confronted with these surveys, they'd always say, opinion surveys, they're this one day and they say something else the next day, and politicians shouldn't be listening to them. And I think that was an issue. So the AfD has basically only gone one way. It's grown pretty consistently. The only dip that they've had in between was during COVID, because they went completely mad on COVID skepticism to the point of conspiracy theories and, Bill Gates putting chips in our arms.
Anti-vaxxers and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And that was too radical for the bulk of Germans, who were actually on the whole fairly happy with Merkel's quite strict course on lockdowns and things. So that was the only time where they had a little dip, because they moved away from the core area that made them large, which was immigration. They've moved back to that now. And so at the last election, which was earlier this year in February, they got over 20% of the vote and are now the largest opposition party. And surveys since have put them about a quarter of the vote, 25%, sometimes 26%. And in some surveys, they've actually topped the polls. And this is something that's never happened in Germany since the Second World War, that you have a far-right party basically topping the polls. And it's now really worrying politicians because they're finally taking this seriously, which is why the course on immigration and also the public debate on it has changed now.
Irish listeners will find this fascinating because, again, Ireland had very little immigration, for a very long, long time. We were immigrants. Then between about 1995 and about 2015, we had a huge amount of Polish workers coming in, Central Europeans in general. But the deal was very much, well, look, these guys are coming to work. So the same sort of idea was that they are contributing to the society. Now the debate has shifted dramatically in Ireland. And again, what you say is the regular politicians are saying, no, you can't say that. You can't say that. Yet survey after survey are saying that Irish people have shifted on immigration. There is no party, or hasn't emerged just yet. But what you're saying in Germany, a bit like reform in the UK, these are the movements of our times, in effect.
Yeah, and I think if most people don't want radical politics, and the mainstream may think that being skeptical about mass immigration is a radical policy, but if you go into a pub or into a sports club or you just speak to people, a lot of people hold fairly moderate views on this, and they basically say, this is too much in terms of housing and pressures on us, and the economy is struggling anyway, and it's not as good or not as optimistic as it was in the early 2000s and late 1990s, where people felt that things were moving forward and there was still a degree of progress optimism. This whole idea that we can basically absorb a lot of issues, including immigration of people who come in and want to work, but often in kind of lower paid sectors, which was seen as a good thing at the time. But even that is an issue now where, wage compression was one of the leading reasons why so many working class people in the UK voted for Brexit, which, even now when you talk to people, most of them aren't sort of swivel-eyed lunatics, but they kind of just say, I found it very difficult to find work as a plumber somewhere because I wasn't willing to work or to live in a flat with 15 other people and be paid accordingly, but I need a wage that pays me enough to live a normal life in the UK with my family. So those issues, I think, people express them in fairly moderate terms when you talk to them, but they find that the political expression of them is missing somewhere. And then when it's only populists or kind of, more far-right parties basically talking to people about these issues, eventually enough people shrug their shoulders and say, fine, then I'll vote for them, and then maybe at least sort of send a message out to politicians to do something, or they've already got angry to a point where they don't care anymore how radical these parties are. I mean, especially in Germany, the tactic has been for a long time to just call the AfD Nazis and sort of, try and impress on people how radical they are and that you can't vote for them. But that doesn't make the actual issue why people vote for them go away. And this has, I think, always been an issue that politicians haven't really understood. They say, oh, but they're Nazis, you can't vote for them. And they say, well, at least you now talk about this topic because this has become such a large political threat to you that you feel you can't ignore it any longer. And that's also how many people think when, especially in Germany, AfD voters, when I say to them in the East where I come from, the region where I was born, there's over 40% of people now vote for the AfD. You walk around and every other person is an AfD voter, and you say to them, is that not a bit extreme for you? And they just say, do you know what? We've stopped caring, really. They can call them Nazis as often as they want. We need something to change, and we've given them 10 years and nothing has changed. So what do you want us to do? And that's where we ended up basically in the situation.
Well, there's one thing I've always really admired in your work, Katja, is the way in which you go in. You sit. You say you sit in pubs, and you do sit in pubs. You do sit. You chat to people. You go to village
Don't
squares.
give it away. I'm trying to keep this a secret.
No, but it's a great way. Because, by the way, Katja's blog is just brilliant. It's industrious. It's Stakhanovite in its output, right? But also, it's like it's to a degree what we try to do. It's called what I call walking around economics. And you walk around and you chat and you sit in a bar and you have a chat. And what you've done, particularly the series you did last year about the East, where you basically went around and chatted to people, was that you were getting this grassroots idea. And now this grassroots idea is translating into a political movement. And that political movement is unifying people across a whole swathe of Germany. I know it's much more popular in the East, but the AfD are popular everywhere in Germany. Do you think that they will be in government next time, or do you think the Christian Democrats will shift to the right? And what you'll find is that the close of the AfD will be robbed by more centrist parties in order to keep them out.
Well, I think, and I just maybe need to explain this briefly to listeners, but it's different, the system compared to, say, the UK or the US. It's not as easy for a single party or a single person to come into power. They have to always have coalition governments. And so at the moment, all the other parties say they won't work with the AfD. But you end up in a situation, Austria has been a case study in this, really, where the largest political party is now the far right, and they're not in government because the other parties are all trying to form a coalition against them. But of course, you end up with that being a very unsatisfying situation. They squabble with each other. And the far right is sitting there saying, well, people voted for the things that we are offering. So now you're still trying to do different politics. It just goes one way, effectively. You end up with the party growing further and further. So I think most likely scenario is not necessarily that they will be outright in power, but it may be that they get what they want and split the political spectrum so far that it becomes difficult for all the other parties to work together. The current coalition wouldn't have a majority right now if there were elections again, so they'd have to really come up with something over the next 3 years to pull that back from the brink.
And just on immigration, where is policy going now in Germany? What is the situation right now?
So they have understood that this is an issue and that they need to do something about it. And so basically they suspended the current asylum policy to a degree. So for example, you were able to bring your family over once you're in Germany, which is why people were unhappy with it. That's now been suspended. Border controls have been reinstated. So even if you now say asylum, if police stop you, you will be pushed back. That's created some tension with the countries around Germany, who are incidentally doing the same thing. So I always think it's a bit hypocritical for a country like Poland or France to complain about this when they actually suspended asylum, both of them, a long time earlier than Germany has. And then I think long term, they're trying to basically find a solution as a bloc for the whole of the EU, to find some sort of way to shift this debate to the outside borders so that the tension within the EU isn't as heated as it is right now. So that's the long term. And they have got a majority within the EU to do that as well. Most of the other EU countries, particularly countries like Denmark, which have very, very strict immigration policy. Sweden's turned theirs around completely from 2015. They were boasting, I think last year, it was that they now have fewer people coming in than leave. And that's something, Sweden was the other country basically that had the complete open policy as Germany did in 2015. And they've realized politically it's just not tangible anymore.
Katja, listen, this is fascinating. Again, it's the 10th anniversary of the month when Angela Merkel opened German doors, and the society has, from what you said, has shifted completely and changed. It's an unrecognizable society from what it was, let's say, 25 years ago.
Well, I mean, I left Germany before 2015, a few years earlier than that, and I find it quite stark going back now, and especially, as I say, in rural areas where you're just not used to seeing people that aren't sort of from there. And it tends to sort of almost what Germans tend to call a parallel sort of society. Basically, they exist side by side, and it's a very odd thing for me to see, having moved away. And in your head, I mean, other people who live in foreign countries will know this. You come back to your own country that you once grew up in, and it's changed. But in Germany's case, it's quite, a strong change, different change, certainly in terms of the way that certain rural areas have been transformed because of this.
Katja, we will see you at Kilkenomics, which is, we're going to be announcing it in a couple of weeks' time. So keep your ears out for that one. But I can't wait. We can talk about this and other things. Brilliant to see you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, this is an issue that we've spoken about over the years on the podcast here. And it just strikes me, I think, attitudes are changing because it is this kind of conflict always between principles, what is good and right and what people should do, versus pragmatism. What is practical? What can we do? How can
Yeah.
we house people, educate people, look after people? It's this conflict that's not just in Germany. It's Ireland, it's the UK, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere in Europe. I mean, I think you're right. I think it's a head versus heart idea. Your heart says, look, we went
Yeah.
away, we were immigrants. These are poor people, they are refugees, they need our help. So your heart is saying, yeah, let's help as many people as we can. But your
Yeah.
head is then saying, hold on a second, where are we going to put these people? What about the housing market? What about our own people who are being displaced? What about our own people who feel threatened? And you've just got to make a call. As we said a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, there probably has to be a number. It has to come down to that.
Yeah.
In Ireland, is it 20,000 immigrants? It's certainly not 140,000 that came last year. That's too many for the housing market in particular. So,
but is it an EU-wide policy that's required? And how do you even do that?
I'll tell you, right? You remember she said the Dublin Accord?
Yeah.
The Dublin Accord was a real Charlie Haughey stroke, right? The Dublin Accord was signed in Dublin in June of 1990, which was the only European summit to ever take a break to watch a soccer match. Okay? Because Ireland played Romania in the quarterfinals of Italian 90.
Oh, the famous match.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Charlie Haughey, who was the Taoiseach at the time, suspended the EU summit to watch the game, right? And then at the end, flew to Rome to be in the stadium.
Right.
So they brought forward the EU summit for a day because Haughey wanted to watch the game and go, but he was such a clever fox, right? He came up with the idea that immigrants should be registered in the country in which they first land, because he calculated that they'll never come to Ireland first.
Yes.
He was a really clever operator. So that's what Germany suspended. And that's what Germany has now reintroduced. But again, the issue of immigration, John, it's not going away, and it's something that everybody has to deal with. We'll talk to you next time.